Hello and welcome. Today we're talking with Izzie Colpitts-Campbell. She's an artist, designer, and community organizer. Izzie has a long-standing experience in a variety of fields, including tech fashion, gaming, and UX production for a technology platform. And I understand that very soon we'll add teacher to that list as well. Welcome, Izzie. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that new role that you're going to play. So what are you developing at the moment for that?
I'm kind of hoping it will be a little bit independent study-like, because I feel like with critical code, there's so many ways to approach it, either from like a research perspective or, creating some kind of visual, like data visualization can be very critical of how we see and develop data, algorithms, platform design. There's so many ways that technology kind of infiltrates our life. And I'll definitely, just because of my background, put a kind of a social justice spin on all of it, particularly with my, work with DMG, thinking about how, technology tools and are built for, creative and marginalized people.
When we talk about your role as a teacher instructor broadly, it's obviously a difficult time for any educational institution, whether it's a formalized institution or more of a grassroots sort of instructional initiative. Um, for creatives and artists broadly, what are they training towards, if you know what I mean?
Um, I think that differs for everyone. I think artists have had so many different kind of ways of dealing with, the current pandemic and limitations in our art practice. I think, there's ways of kind of doing things safely, like this interview, and just going forward or stopping or adjusting. Um, I've with DMG, we actually had to pivot a number of our exhibitions online. So I think there's still opportunity to create art, but I do think there's an extra emphasis on what technologies and tools we are using to make that art. Even if you aren't making digital work, you're now potentially, performing through platforms like Zoom, which changes, your relationship to how you're creating or sharing that work.
And DMG, of course, is Games Making Games. Can you talk a little bit more about that platform?
Yeah, so DMG is a community like originally based in Toronto. Now that we're more remote, it's really broadened our potential for what we think of as community. We've always been somewhere for anyone interested in making games, to explore that with a real focus on making that space for marginalized people who have, very traditionally been kept out of technology development spaces, and games in particular. We see games as a way of telling stories and narratives. It's really a cultural product, which I think a lot of, the arts world is coming to see that as they are cultural products, in a similar way that film is. There is this relationship with industry, but there are these small independent creators making really meaningful work in this area of kind of games, interactive media, whatever you want to really call it. Our definition of a game is so broad, from digital games to tabletop games to, little card games, mobile games, all of those kind of things are in there.
And it's interesting how games have relatively recently been starting to looked at more seriously in the media arts broadly. Was it a
Yeah.
deliberate decision for DMG to focus on game development within its sort of social mandate specifically, or did it just happen?
I think it started with a group of friends who didn't have a space to talk critically about the games they were making, playing, learning to engage with. So yes, absolutely, it was made specifically around games, starting with a very small group of people. We still have our monthly socials, and that's just where people share what they're working on. And so as our community grows and shifts, our definition of games grow and shift. What we need to support them shifts. Myself, I wasn't one of the founding members, but you talked about my interest in kind of electronic and software art was how I got into DMG, which was really looking at I'm making these primarily wearable electronics, physical objects that are interacting with the body. And I really wanted a space to think about how technology works, how I can build technology, and I learned the tools to make those interactive experiences with, because they are so close to a game. They are these kind of playful objects that, there are rules of how you interact with them, which really is so much of game design and game development.
Yeah, and the problems, or maybe not problems, but the issues that you identify as one of the founding motivations for DMG are something that we recognize, I think, broadly in the media arts still. Are games a point of entry to, let's say, break open some of the more static elements within the field of media arts?
I think they're one of those entry points. I think that adding that interactivity is kind of something that, computation in a broad sense gives us. We aren't just looking at, a movie to watch. We're thinking about how we're actually interacting with that piece of media, which I think, we've come from many different spaces. I mean, I always point to a funny pattern in wearable technology where, similar to my path, it's like I worked on, kind of queer performance body video work. And then suddenly someone was like, oh, you can put a button to interact with that video work. And then I was like, well, if I'm having this physical object in the world, why don't I just make that an experience that the person can wear? Because when you think about, that's one entry point. And then, through kind of playing with these electronics, I came to this, connection with games and found DMG. So actually, that's a very similar story where people see their art practice, and DMG is a space to actually come in and engage with games and bring that back into their art practice, as well as, join industry. We just recently did the online exhibition. We had to pivot at the last moment. I think our opening was like April 15th or something. Was actually a residency of our past participants looking at their first game that they made with DMG. And we actually gave them funding to go and kind of change or redesign or revisit that game to update it so that it's playable now. Because, trying to look at how, one, DMG has had an impact on people's practices, but also just, how people would revisit that first kind of prototype and change it. And it was interesting to see all of those changes and people think about actually how did games and this interactivity that I've kind of added to my practice change what I'm doing. We've got some people who are now doing a master's in psychology around, the impacts of VR, which is like a very obvious through point to games. We've got other folks who, are now writing, novels that, started at a game jam, playing with similar ideas. And so I think it's just trying to track those. It's not all the same narrative. It's never always the same narrative, but there are these things that people take up and learn from, the community and change it as they go.
Potentially interesting link to a current development in the arts broadly, but certainly within the media arts, which is that idea of experiential art, immersiveness of art, and that even within the context of the pandemic with so many closures, that I think 2 or 3 new museums have been announced that are exclusively about digital, interactive, immersive art. Do you see new business models or new ways for artist prosperity emerging also through your DMG activities?
I think it's funny. We had kind of in the past been playing with a lot of these digital forms, and sometimes actually I think getting a bit of pushback, like, oh, well, that's, it's not a real exhibition if it's online. And I think because all of us were having these conversations of like, actually, what does an online exhibition have? I felt a little bit like the work that we've been doing at DMG suddenly actually had this real space to grow. Thinking about what tools we're using, how we're engaging with technology, how, digital experiences can be, seen as art. And so I do think like actually games has been doing a little bit, particularly thinking about business models, there are spaces in games like itch.io, which you can self-publish your digital pieces and sell them for, as much or as little as you like, or a pay what you can model. And I think these things often were not necessarily seen as like quite as legitimate art practice. And I think that actually there is more space at this current moment. It's because none of us can be exhibiting in a white cube gallery right now.
For you, what could that idea of prosperity for artists look like? And prosperity and stability maybe as two different sides of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think like I always think about, particularly like economic sustainability as like a community driven thing. I don't think that the arts will succeed with, a couple very prosperous individuals. It's really like we all need to work as one community to figure out how we can actually, like, particularly with marginalized folks, share that prosperity and all be coming up with these new models of sustainability. I think this kind of connects, to work DMG is doing and also the work that we did in the Digital Economies Lab, kind of thinking about, this idea of a artist union and how can we share our knowledge and our understanding and our experience within the arts world to help each other. And so I think that's like maybe pretty idealistic, but I think it's a pretty great base for, success in the art world, and particularly success for like individual creative people, whatever they're making.
You already mentioned that part of your contribution within the Digital Economies Lab revolved around the idea of an artist union. Recently, there was a book by Ariella Aisha Azulay called Potential History, Unlearning Imperialism, in which a series of prompts were given to think around, including one that says, what if we all went on strike? And this was aimed at museum workers, but anybody working in sort of the artistic field. What other, well, first of all, what are some of the ideas around this idea of an artist union, and potentially what other lessons could be learned from workers' unions and other labor initiatives, let's say?
I think the biggest one is really like we will find more success together. I think this is shown all over. I think one great example of like, a creative union or film unions, right? And particularly when we're working in, these creative entertainment spaces where, it's not like, one, they're very like glamorous jobs. People love the things that they're doing. And two, it's not like the work is a bit more ephemeral to say like this work that I'm doing is making X of this. The economy is a little bit different with entertainment. And so, people who are making money off of them will always want to get whatever you are supplying for the lowest cost. And that, when we all say actually that cost is higher, that will have power, which, is really what, workers organizing is all about.
Where do you see sort of the within the creative field broadly, where does the power lie?
I mean, currently, I think it's with, people who are, engaging, freelancers for, small tasks that they need help with. It really depends on what field we're working in though, right? Like with something like games, it really is in, maker studios and large studios. It's not with the individual workers.
It's interesting to think about if power could be brought back to the makers directly um, within the idea of a union. But at the same time, things like the prompt, let's go on strike, is an interesting one, because I remember a strike at a local museum here in the Ottawa area that went on for a long time, but very few people seemed to notice. And the leverage that came from that particular action seemed, from the outside in any case, limited.
Mm-hmm.
What are some other tactics or strategies that creative workers could use if their work is valued in different ways?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where the work comes in, right? This is where I think this piece particularly we're working on is like thinking through how we can actually begin to think about this. Like, I think that if it was a silver bullet, XYZ, and you have leverage, then, we would obviously have already done it. And so I think this is the work. Like, I don't have the answer for the thing to fix this. But I think this is where, this piece is thinking about how we can actually start to brainstorm things that we do need help with, that the community does need support in, and kind of in a playful way engage those topics of what are the kind of community need here.
What you remind me of is that it cannot necessarily be other people doing it, and then once it's done, you
Yes,
join in.
Yeah.
It does need to be a collaborative, communal effort as well.
Yeah, and like it's not easy discussions, right? Like particularly when you're talking about, personal prosperity, personal finances and economics, that's a risk on the table. Like when you are thinking about, whether I will be able to, house myself, feed myself, those kinds of things. And I think this is why often these movements come from marginalized people, because often they have much more, they have much less to risk because they don't have access to all of these systems that work for a very small amount of people. And so that's why these movements often come from, those that have less in the first place, because, it is a hard thing to say the thing that's working for me is not working for everyone else, and I am going to change that.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing to think about, that when we talk about solidarity or mutual support, that it implies that there is a risk involved, especially for the people who are already entrenched in some of those established systems.
Yeah.
What could be some of the approaches to sort of, let's say, stimulate that sense of solidarity and to widen that scope for that, sorry, I'm not expressing myself very well, that sense of that there is a within and a without of the system, that the people who are in a certain, let's say, cultural sphere, and the people who are outside of that. How do we breach that?
Yeah, I mean, I think in my work, I'm really looking at supporting supporting marginalized people. Like, I think that is kind of one, there are many tactics for this. I think, there are people doing more work to kind of cross these divides, cross these barriers, have those discussions. And I think on like a personal level, I have a lot of those discussions with friends. I do think that my tactic has always kind of been one of like loyal support for marginalized people, listening to what they need, what I can give, what I might need. And so I think in that ways, I mean, I think I'm more entrenched in that kind of like solidarity and mutual aid thinking, where actually, in my mind, the solution does not always come from outside. It comes from the community growing together. That's always been my approach. So I think something like, this program we just launched, Damage Labs, is really about DMG wants to see more studios that are taking an approach to games, which is of thinking of the cultural impact of the things that we're making, the working conditions, the collaborations that are being fostered in the industry. And so there's often multiple approaches. If I want to improve the stories that are being told in the industry, I could go and talk AAA games and try and improve that. I am the one who takes the approach of like, actually, let's build the studios that we want to see in the world. Let's come up with frameworks to support those people. It's just always where I've had my energy to do that work. I don't know that really answers your question, but I think sometimes the work that I do is in the vein of supporting, what I can, like my community, supporting marginalized people. Finding people who are like-minded, who want to create this work, who want to think about, how we enact more cooperative business models, and be an example of that work, even on a small scale to start.
I'm reminded of a conversation I heard recently with the founder of Substack, the newsletter platform, where he said that he was in the social media business before and was not liking what he saw, but realized at some point that he could only do so much within the limits of the social media sphere, and he had to step outside of it in order to create something new. Is that a little bit the approach that you're taking with this Damage Lab initiative?
Yeah, I definitely, like, this initiative is, primarily meant to find support for people who want to build studios in this specific way of thinking about the impact of the games that we're making on like a cultural level, on a workers level. And so absolutely, that's the mentality that we're taking is, we want these studios to exist, so let's support their existence, because we know that actually the models within investing in game studios is, I'll give you money and you get 10x money back to me, which is not like, there's not a lot you can do with that when you're like, actually the thing I want to get out of this money is some kind of social impact. Like, I want to see more authentic representation of my identity. I want to see children learning from games, personal emotional coping mechanisms. And that's what I really want to get. And if you can kind of do that and come up with a business model that makes 10x money, but when it comes down to it, your promise to taking on that investment will always be getting more money. And that's just the fact.
But it's really interesting to take an approach to cultural production from the perspective of a social impact project. How did you get to that point? Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think this was something that has been we've kind of been thinking about a bit at DMG, and our ED brought Jenny Faber kind of brought this investment readiness program, which is specifically about nonprofits and charities getting into this kind of social enterprise. So that's our funding. Our funding is from the government funding to actually support nonprofits finding financial sustainability.
And that works within the confines of a field that is traditionally seen as a commercial venture as well.
Yeah. And I mean, social enterprises are commercial enterprises. So it actually seemed like that's why we felt it was a good fit for DMG, because we do actually have this very commercial aspect of games that we've kind of been we haven't really dived into quite as quickly as we would, some of our educational programming or community programming, because we didn't see that fit. We of course supported members who wanted to start game studios, but we weren't quite as actively engaged with industry as we are with Damage Labs.
Just wanted to take a little side trip on the topic of business models. You have been working for a tech company for a couple of years.
Yeah.
That idea of the platform business model that we see in many ways, whether it's Uber or Airbnb. Have you looked at that type of business model and through sort of a counter research lens looked at how some of those principles could be applied to the cultural sector?
I mean, I don't know that I have like a strong thesis for you. I think they're all kind of inputs to any thinking that I am doing. I don't know that I make like all the time direct correlations between that work that I am doing for kind of a professional work. But I mean, I think there is an element of, at its core, like platforms have actually a lot of similarity to game design or community development. Like with platform design, you really are just thinking about relationships and how we're creating rules around how people interact and with what. I think often when I'm thinking about my professional work versus more of my artistic practice, the outcome is different. When you are designing anything, there's going to be a certain outcome with an art piece that you want to design for. So it's one thing to design a user experience for a large, massive software company where it's like we want it to be really understandable and easy to use, and often efficiency is going to be really high up on what you're actually thinking about you're designing for. In like an art practice, I am designing an experience, talking about experiential art design, but often you're looking for almost the opposite of efficiency. It's about bringing up questions is something that I often, which links into like critical design practices, where you aren't designing to solve a question, you're designing to pose a question, which I think art really brings up as well. I think though, in the kind of community organizing aspect, it really does make me think about what platforms we are using and how that data is being shared or could be shared. Like there's obviously just like a depth of understanding around how platforms might use and incorporate data that I might be exposing users to, community members to, on both of those thoughts. Like they're similar thought processes. They usually end at a different place.
I guess part of why I was going for that question was the idea that the platform in the end is what gains the most, and the people who are connected to that platform on either side, where it's mostly about volume, right?
Yes,
Famously, what people get, what the actual artists get from Spotify, for instance, is minute in comparison to what Spotify itself gains. So and going back to that idea of bringing power back to and agency and control back to the people who actually create the content and the artistic product, whether there is a subversion or a counterfoil way to look at these platforms that might benefit creators?
I think it's all gray. You know, like there's ways that we can use these tools to our benefit, and there's ways that are not. Like, I don't think it's like, you know, you as an artist using a platform is inherently bad. But understanding that these platforms aren't made for the production or support of, you know, cultural products, I think is one thing to think about. What you are getting out of these platforms is another thing to think about. You know, there is a massive volume. And so, yeah, I think that's more around literacy and critical engagement with these things, right? Which is often, you know, I think one of the great benefits, I think I talked a little bit about, of this pandemic is like, oh, people are suddenly thinking about digital art production in a much more broad context, you know, like it's not just the web artists who are like, let's make an online exhibition because, you know, we now need to sell paintings and sculptures and all these things online. But then the counter to that is very rapidly, we've all had to take on these digital tools and platforms. And so I think at the beginning I was having these like, oh my goodness, what about, have people thought about what tools they're using and like what they're signing up for and what they might be giving away in doing that, which I think is where there is some benefit in literacy and knowledge of how to actually build our own systems and tooling and know when it's worthwhile to do that. Because I think that's one thing sometimes we have a lack of resources, like in all of our various arts organizing fashions, and so we are often looking for the quickest or the easiest or the cheapest, which needs to then also be weighed with, you know, the you know, why is it cheap or why are we getting paid less, you know, but what's the payoff there?
And very often it's a tricky thing to negotiate because very often the individual creators are working to make a living and to create.
Yes.
And then to create the space around that to also have to be aware of some of the other forces that are working in on them is a very difficult. There's a lot of pressure in that sense.
Yeah, and I mean, I think with most things digital, like these aren't new conversations either. It's not like we suddenly have like oh, as artists, we need to, you know, engage with these like capitalistic models of art production. Like that's been happening since, you know, like, you know, forever. I look when, you know, that most of our, you know, particularly Western history of art is around, you know, who is paying for this? Then I will make it, you know. Leonardo da Vinci sure as hell didn't want to paint Jesus. So yeah, I think like they're just shifted conversations in a digital world. You know, it's before we were making art museums, you know, private, public. What's the difference between engaging in those different types of arts institutions? These are all conversations that aren't new.
Just moving a bit to what you're doing with your various initiatives with the DMG, but certainly with the Damage Labs, that idea of community building and of being interdependent within those types of communities. What is your approach to that type of community building?
I think we're approaching Damage Labs. It's like it is quite a you know, in the industry business world, but we're bringing all of the thoughts of, you know, mutual aid and grassroots organizing that DMG has always had at its core. And so, you know, we do want to come up with a way that these studios, as they grow and build, can support more of these studios being created. You know, we don't want this program to be one cohort. We want to figure out a way that these cohorts give back to this community, and we can grow this initiative, which I think is really important. Which I think is a call out to that kind of interdependence. We're making damage labs because the existing systems for funding, or DMG believed the existing systems for funding games was not, at best, not productive, at worst, harmful to marginalized people to engage with. And so we're hopefully creating some alternative to that. And, in that, we have to figure out how we can actually spread that to be larger than just, the 10 people we could let into our first cohort. And, we did get many more applications than we thought. Like, the need for this type of programming was really felt when we put out the call, and everyone's responses to this program has been, yeah, people do see this lack as well.
It's an interesting proposition because on the one hand, you want it to be supported maybe by the structures that are already in place, while at the same time trying to find alternatives for those same structures.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is the navigating, this is the critique, this is the element of literacy and experimentation and new models of doing this kind of work.
I'm trying to formulate a question here because what you are talking about reminds me of a recent book, the title of which escapes me, but it talks about the head, the hand, and the heart as types of work that can be done, and how for a long time the head, so the knowledge work, has been prioritized at the cost of the heart work, so the care, and handwork, which refers more to the direct application of craft and other types of work in that sense. You seem to straddle all those three elements in your work. Is that something that you?
I mean, I think I do. Like, I value interdisciplinary work in a really meaningful way. I often do have this tension between a love and respect for what I consider deep craft knowledge, and I think through my career have had a hard time kind of, I care a lot for this deep, and when I say deep craft, it's one thing, this is the one thing that I'm an expert at. I'm gonna make, as a kid I was I would love to be a jeweler. I love jewelry, and I've done jewelry, it's great, but there is an element of it that I'm just there is so many details of the medium of metal to learn before you can get to that point where you are really playing with how you can get into that, change how you're manipulating that material. And I think that goes for so many different fields. And I think that's I guess you're kind of talking about the handwork, but I think that can apply as well to, I'm getting a PhD in, specifically this one area of this very specific thing, where I have often bobbled between a lot of these things to greater or lesser success. And I think it's just something that I've always done. I'm a very broad thinker, and I even going back, I think I kind of call it when I started my degree, I started at the NASCAD on the East Coast, and the program that I was in was called Intermedia, which is this kind of it's this a specific art practice, which is very funny to have a full degree program about kind of an art practice, a theoretical art framework almost. But the whole idea being it's not about having two mediums that you do and are good at. It's about finding that center point at where they actually meaningfully connect. So I think that's just the mentality that I've often taken into, the thing that I really enjoy is finding where all of these things meaningfully connect, which is different than something like mixed media, which is I'm going to paint and I'm going to sculpt, and they will have a conversation, but I'm putting mediums together. It's like, no, actually, I want to find the connections between these things and kind of interrogate that.
Well, it mirrors sort of what we see in even your initiatives as well, where many of these things become intertwined, and there is not really a clear one discipline that you're trying to move forward. So to close off the conversation, and especially from your point of view, straddling so many different fields and points of entry, I'm curious how you might see this particular point in time with so many different influences, from climate emergency to social justice, even outside of the current pandemic. What are the possibilities for artists and creatives at this point going forward? Which role could artists and creatives play?
I'm not sure if it's like that much different than, we've seen historically. I think there's a few more opportunities to kind of share work more broadly, through like digital mediums, particularly, across borders and all that stuff now. But I do think there's that artistic work is about looking at these things that are happening and processing them in some way, or critiquing them, drawing out questions, allowing, an expression of a response to these things. I don't know if that's like a unique opportunity that we have right now, but I think like these things are all very important for us to be grappling with, to be discussing, and you can write an essay about climate change, which is one way of like thinking about and processing it, and artists are often making something to express similar ideas, which is just a different medium of engagement than other forms, scientific investigation, and that's another way of looking at these things. This is the context that we're all making work within, and there's obviously ways of making beautiful pieces of cultural significance that don't really pull directly on these things, but you can't really ignore the context that anything is made in. And I mean, personally, I think a more opinionated view on that is like, these are the things that artists should be engaging with, and that's where really meaningful art comes in. But that's probably a more personal, my own my own preference.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Izzie, for taking the time to have this conversation with us. And we're really looking forward to what is going to happen with the Damage Labs and what wonderful projects come out of that.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.